Hey guys! Tonight, we're floating back a few thousand years, to a time when eyeliner was gender neutral, sibling marriages were considered perfectly normal, and the gods apparently had nothing better to do than watch royal families implode under the weight of their own dynastic choices. So, dim the lights, get comfortable, and let's talk about King Tutankhamun. Yes, the boy king himself. The one who's famous not so much for what he did in life, but for the fact that he died young, got buried with an absurd amount of golden bling, and then had his tomb discovered by a bunch of British archaeologists who were very proud of themselves in 1922. Now, if you're imagining Tutankhamun as some glamorous young ruler striding through palaces, looking like the poster boy of ancient Egypt, just relax. The reality is far less majestic. What we actually have here is a chronically ill, probably deformed teenager, the product of way too much royal inbreeding, who spent his short reign mostly being controlled by adults. Which, to be fair, is not entirely shocking when you take the throne at around 8 or 9 years old. But to understand Tut, we need to gently roll back the stone door and drift into the real star of this show, his family tree. Because, spoiler alert, it's less of a tree and more of a tightly knotted shrub. Let's begin with his father. Akhenaten. You know, the guy who decided that Egypt, after centuries of happily worshipping a giant pantheon of gods with animal heads, needed a radical rebrand. He basically woke up one morning and said, nope. Forget all of them. We're doing monotheism now. And just like that, Aten, the sun disk, was declared the one true God. It was Egypt's first, and very short-lived, flirtation with monotheism. Now, Akhenaten is one of those pharaohs who gets remembered more for being weird than for being effective. He moved the capital to a brand new city in the desert, which is always a great way to burn through state funds. He banned the worship of Egypt's other gods, which made him wildly unpopular with priests who had enjoyed a cushy lifestyle for centuries. And he insisted on being portrayed in art with elongated features, wide hips, and a sort of awkward belly that looked more Renaissance Madonna than macho Pharaoh. Was it a religious statement? Was it a health condition? Was he just really committed to body positivity? Scholars are still debating. But here's the important part, Akhenaten was Tutankhamun's father. And to make things a little more complicated, Tut's mother was not the famous Queen Nefertiti, as people sometimes assume. No, his mother was Akhenaten's sister. Or possibly half-sister. Either way, it was a close genetic match. Because when you're a royal in ancient Egypt, why diversify the family gene pool when you can just double down on keeping things in-house? So, Tut was the product of sibling marriage. And unfortunately, his health would pay the price for generations of this dynastic strategy. When Tut was born, around 1341 BCE, the Egyptian court was in turmoil. His father's religious revolution had left the empire unstable, the priests were fuming, and the people were stuck trying to figure out why they couldn't just worship their old gods like normal. In the middle of all this, Tut entered the world, a small child destined to carry both the weight of the throne and the consequences of his family's decisions. From what we can gather, Tut was sickly from the beginning. Modern science has been surprisingly nosy here, because Tut's body has been CT scanned more times than a frequent flyer's luggage. The results show he had a clubfoot, a cleft palate, and probably some other skeletal issues. Walking long distances wasn't really in his skill set. He also suffered from malaria. More than once. Which is just bad luck on top of bad genetics. And if you're wondering how historians know about the clubfoot, it's because they found over 100 walking sticks buried with him. 1 or 2 walking sticks, fine, maybe it's just a fashionable accessory. But over 100? That's not a trend, that's a mobility aid collection. Now, when Akhenaten died, Tut was still a child. The throne skipped around a little in the chaos. There may have been a brief reign by a mysterious pharaoh named Smenkhare, possibly Tut's older brother or uncle. Scholars still argue about it. But eventually, the crown landed on Tutankhamun's head. Yes, that was his original name, Tutankhamun, meaning living image of Aten. Very on brand with his father's sun worship agenda. But remember how unpopular that religion was. Within just a few years, Tut was encouraged, and by encouraged, I mean pressured by every adult advisor who wanted their cushy jobs back, to abandon Aten and bring back the old gods. So Tutankhamun quietly rebranded himself as Tutankhamun, living image of Ammonius, returning to the traditional Egyptian pantheon. The temples reopened, the priests celebrated, and Egypt breathed a sigh of relief. Of course, this decision wasn't really Tut's. He was still a kid. The real power at court rested in the hands of his advisors, especially a man named I, who would later crown himself Pharaoh, and General Horemheb, who was basically waiting in the wings with military backing. Tut was more like a ceremonial mascot while the adults ran the show. And then there's Tut's marriage. Because of course, no royal life is complete without a questionable family union. He married Ankhesenamun, who was his half-sister. Or possibly his full sister. Again, details are fuzzy, but either way, the family tree was doubling back on itself. She was one of Nefertiti's daughters, making the relationship about as close as it gets without raising eyebrows in a royal court that had very few boundaries left to cross. Together, they tried to continue the dynasty, but tragedy struck. They had at least 2 daughters, both stillborn. Their tiny mummified remains were found buried with Tut, and modern studies show severe genetic deformities. It's one of those heartbreaking but not entirely surprising outcomes of centuries of royal inbreeding. Tut himself wasn't doing great either. By his teenage years, he was frail, probably in pain, and heavily reliant on those walking sticks. Still, he managed to carry out some ceremonial duties, like overseeing building projects that reversed his father's unpopular reforms. Basically, Tut's reign was less about new ideas and more about undoing the chaos Akhenaten had caused. But Tut's story, as you know, doesn't end with a glorious reign. He died young, around 18 or 19 years old. The cause? That's still debated. Some theories say malaria combined with a broken leg led to an infection. Others suggest genetic weakness finally caught up to him. There's even been speculation about murder, but nothing conclusive. What we do know is that his death left Egypt in another crisis. He had no surviving heirs, and his widow Ankhesenamun was left scrambling. In one of the more desperate and fascinating episodes of ancient history, she actually wrote a letter to the Hittite king, Egypt's enemy at the time, begging him to send one of his sons for her to marry. She basically said, "I have no son, my husband is dead, and I refuse to marry one of my servants. Send me a prince." It was bold. It was desperate. And it almost worked. The Hittite king sent a prince, but he was mysteriously killed before reaching Egypt. Which sounds exactly like something I or Horemheb might have arranged. And sure enough, after Tut's death, I stepped in and married Ankhesenamun himself. She then vanishes from history, possibly disposed of, possibly just erased. Not the fairy tale ending she was hoping for. Of course, all of this might have faded into obscurity if not for what happened millennia later. In 1922, Howard Carter stumbled across Tut's tomb in the Valley of the Kings. And unlike most Egyptian tombs, which had been looted centuries earlier, Tut's was almost intact. Suddenly, this minor, sickly boy king was catapulted into international fame, his golden mask plastered on every history textbook, museum poster, and Halloween costume for the next 100 years. It's ironic, really. Tutankhamun wasn't a great warrior, or a brilliant ruler, or a religious innovator. He was a teenager with health problems who reigned for less than a decade. And yet today, he's one of the most famous pharaohs in history. Mostly because nobody robbed his grave. Sometimes, luck really is everything. Let's float here for a moment. In our next stretch, we'll drift deeper into the details of Tut's tomb, the so-called curse that followed its discovery, and the modern science that keeps poking at his poor mummified body. Because apparently, 3,000 years of peace in the afterlife wasn't enough. Now here's the thing about tombs in ancient Egypt, they were basically neon-lit raw meat signs. Pharaohs loved to be buried with enormous piles of gold, furniture, jewelry, food, chariots, weapons, and just about anything else they thought might be useful in the afterlife. Which is great, except grave robbers also thought those things were useful in this life. So almost every royal tomb in Egypt was broken into and looted, sometimes within a few decades of being sealed. But somehow, Tutankhamun's tiny tomb slipped through the cracks. It was tucked awkwardly beneath another, partially hidden, and probably forgotten because his reign was so short and insignificant. His successors had little reason to glorify him, so the location wasn't advertised. It was like the ancient version of mislabeling a box in the attic and then just never checking it again. Fast forward to 1922. The world was in the middle of an Egyptology craze. European archaeologists were running around with pickaxes, not always respecting local customs or conservation, and treating entire ancient cultures like playgrounds for their careers. Enter Howard Carter, a British archaeologist with an obsession. He had been working in Egypt for years, funded by Lord Carnarvon, a wealthy aristocrat who, as it happens, was running out of patience and money. Carter had been searching for Tutankhamun's tomb for 5 years with no luck. Imagine digging in the desert for half a decade, sweating under the Egyptian sun, while your rich patron sighs and checks his pocketbook. By 1922, Carnarvon basically said, "One more season. If you don't find anything, we're done." No pressure. And then, of course, Carter's team hit pay dirt. Literally. They found a set of steps leading down into the ground in the Valley of the Kings. After some clearing, they uncovered a sealed doorway with royal cartouches, the oval name rings used for pharaohs. Carter, probably trying very hard not to scream, had found the entrance to Tutankhamun's tomb. Now picture the moment. November 26, 1922. Carter makes a small hole in the doorway, lights a candle, and peers inside. Lord Carnarvon is standing there, tense, waiting. Carnarvon asks, "Can you see anything?" And Carter replies with what became one of the most famous understatements in archaeology, "Yes, wonderful things." Behind that door was a treasure hoard the likes of which no one had seen before. Golden couches shaped like animals. Chariots stacked against the wall. Jewelry scattered around like someone had tipped over a giant treasure chest. And at the center, a series of nested shrines and coffins that eventually revealed Tutankhamun himself. It was chaos. Newspapers around the world went wild. Egypt mania hit a fever pitch. Museums were suddenly full of golden masks and artifacts. Tut, who had been a minor, forgotten pharaoh, was now a global superstar. And then, of course, came the curse. Because what's the point of finding a treasure-filled tomb if you don't spice it up with some supernatural drama? The curse of the pharaohs wasn't really an ancient Egyptian idea. The Egyptians did inscribe warnings on some tombs, usually saying things like, "Don't mess with this or you'll get smited." But the whole Hollywood version of deadly curses came later. Still, when Lord Carnarvon died just a few months after entering the tomb, from a mosquito bite that got infected, of all things, the press had a field day. Suddenly, every unlucky event connected to the excavation was pinned on Tut's wrath. A cobra supposedly ate Carter's pet canary. People got sick. Lights went out in Cairo when Carnarvon died. It was the kind of perfect spooky story that made for irresistible headlines. The reality, of course, was much less glamorous. Carnarvon had a weak immune system and happened to get a bad infection. Many of the supposed deaths of curse victims were exaggerated or completely invented by newspapers. Howard Carter himself, the man who opened the tomb and handled Tut's mummy repeatedly, lived another 16 years and died peacefully at age 64. Which doesn't exactly scream ancient curse. But hey, the idea stuck. Even today, people still talk about Tut's curse as if it were fact. Because let's face it, it's just more fun to imagine a teenage mummy throwing shade at modern archaeologists from the afterlife. And speaking of archaeologists throwing shade, let's talk about what modern science has done to poor Tut's body. If you think being dead for 3,000 years means you finally get to rest, well, not if you're famous. Tut's mummy has been unwrapped, examined, X-rayed, CT scanned, DNA tested, and generally poked more times than a lab rat. Every decade or so, a new group of scientists comes along convinced they'll finally solve the mystery of his death. And every time, they mostly just confirm what we already knew: he was a sickly teenager with a clubfoot and probably a lot of pain. At one point, researchers thought he had been murdered, because his skull looked like it had a head wound. But later scans showed the damage was probably caused by Carter's excavation team, who were a bit rough when removing the body from the sticky resins of the coffin. So, no murder. Just sloppy archaeology. Then there was a theory that he died in a chariot accident because of a broken rib cage. Again, no. That was probably damage from mishandling during the embalming process. Or from the fire that seems to have happened when his body reacted with oxygen after being sealed. Yes, Tut's corpse may have actually combusted inside the tomb. Talk about bad luck. Most likely, the cause of death was much less dramatic. He had malaria, confirmed by DNA. He had a badly broken leg, possibly from a fall. Combine that with genetic weaknesses and compromised immunity, and you've got a recipe for a short life. But science didn't stop there. They've reconstructed his face using 3D imaging, and the result was, well, let's just say not quite the glamorous golden mask. The mask is iconic, smooth, symmetrical, dazzling. The face reconstruction, on the other hand, looked more like an awkward teenager with an overbite. Which, honestly, feels fitting. And let's not forget the DNA testing, which confirmed the sibling marriage and mapped out Tut's family tree like a genetic horror show. It showed multiple generations of close inbreeding, which probably contributed to his deformities. Basically, the family's obsession with marrying sisters, daughters, and cousins didn't do the royal gene pool any favors. So, every time scientists proudly announce a new discovery about Tut, it's usually just another layer of evidence that yes, his life was short, painful, and unlucky. But at least he had some really nice jewelry. Meanwhile, Tut's artifacts have toured the world, pulling in millions of visitors. His golden mask is instantly recognizable, plastered across history textbooks, documentaries, and gift shop mugs. His tomb treasures remain some of the most famous archaeological finds in history. Which makes it ironic that Tutankhamun himself was such a minor king. He didn't conquer lands. He didn't build great monuments of his own. He didn't leave behind revolutionary laws or poetry. His fame is entirely accidental, a fluke of preservation and timing. If grave robbers had found his tomb centuries earlier, we probably wouldn't even be talking about him today. Alright, so we've met Tut, the sickly boy king who spent most of his short life leaning on walking sticks and occasionally being wheeled out for ceremonies while his advisors handled the messy business of ruling. But to really understand how Tut got into that position, we need to zoom out a little. Let's glide gently into the bigger picture, his wonderfully dysfunctional family and the dynasty that was already collapsing under its own weight. Because if Tutankhamun's life seems tragic, trust me, it's nothing compared to the bizarre carnival that was his family tree. Let's start with his father, Akhenaten, because you really can't talk about Tut without mentioning the guy who turned Egypt upside down for no apparent reason. As we touched on before, Akhenaten is the pharaoh who basically woke up one morning and decided polytheism was out, monotheism was in. Forget the hundreds of gods Egypt had happily worshipped for centuries. No more Anubis with his jackal head, no more Ra with his falcon glory, no more Osiris ruling the underworld. Nope. From now on, it was just Aden. The sun disk. A glowing circle in the sky. That was it. No animal head. No elaborate mythology. Just the sun. Which, on one hand, makes sense. It's the giant ball of fire keeping everyone alive. On the other hand, it doesn't exactly have the drama of a falcon-headed sky god. Akhenaten doubled down. He shut down temples, enraged the priesthood, and even moved Egypt's capital from Thebes to a brand new city called Akhetaten, which today we know as Amarna. And as anyone who's ever tried to start a utopian city in the desert can tell you, it didn't go great. Now, standing next to Akhenaten in all the surviving art is his famous queen, Nefertiti. You've seen her. The bust of Nefertiti is one of the most iconic artifacts in the world. She's beautiful, elegant, and has inspired endless romantic ideas about her power and influence. But here's the thing, Nefertiti's actual story is murky at best. At some point during Akhenaten's reign, she just disappears. The records stop mentioning her. Was she disgraced? Did she fall out of favor? Did she die? Or did she actually take on a new role, ruling as pharaoh under another name? There's a theory that she may have been Smenkhare, the mysterious co-ruler who briefly appears right before Tutankhamun takes the throne. Because what's more Egyptian than hiding your queen under a new pharaoh alias and hoping nobody notices? We don't know for sure. All we know is that right before Tut's reign, there was this mysterious blip, a short-lived ruler whose identity has never been confirmed. Scholars have argued about it for decades, and probably will for decades more. And then, of course, there's the matter of Tut's mother. She wasn't Nefertiti. She wasn't a glamorous queen. She was Akhenaten's sister. Or half-sister. Probably one of those secondary wives nobody really wrote much about. Which tells you everything you need to know about Egyptian royal marriage priorities. The family tree was so tangled by this point that you'd need a specialist in ancient genealogy and soap operas to make sense of it. Now, after Akhenaten's death, Egypt was in chaos. His monotheistic experiment had gone down like a lead balloon, and the priests were ready to drag all those old gods back onto their pedestals. Enter Tutankhamun, still a child, whose original name, Tutankhamun, tied him to his father's failed religion. That wasn't going to fly. So, as we said earlier, the name got changed to Tutankhamun, and the temples reopened. But let's be clear, none of this was really his decision. He was a boy, maybe 9 years old when he became pharaoh. The actual decisions were being made by the men behind the throne. One of them was Tut's great-uncle, an older court official who had been around since the days of Akhenaten. He was the kind of political survivor who manages to outlast multiple regimes just by nodding at the right time and stabbing the right people in the back. I became Tut's chief advisor, and after Tut's death, he crowned himself pharaoh. Which is about as subtle as putting your name on the company door the day after your boss mysteriously dies. Then there was Horemheb. Unlike who was a court insider, Horemheb was a military man. A general. He was ambitious, and he had the loyalty of the army. During Tut's reign, he was essentially commander-in-chief, and while he didn't grab the throne immediately, he was clearly waiting his turn. And sure enough, after I died, Horemheb seized power. He ruled for nearly 30 years and then tried very hard to erase the memory of Akhenaten, Tut, and the entire Amarna experiment. Which is why Tutankhamun himself might have been forgotten if not for Carter's lucky discovery in 1922. So, if you're keeping track here, Tut's reign was basically babysat by a great-uncle with sticky fingers and a general with long-term plans. Tut himself. He was sick, frail, and barely old enough to shave. He didn't exactly have the power to stand up to either of them. His job was to smile for the statues, wave during ceremonies, and let everyone else run Egypt in his name. And speaking of statues, have you noticed how idealized those look? Ancient Egyptian art was not about realism. It was about projecting an image of divine perfection. Which is why Tutankhamun's statues show him looking youthful, strong, and eternally symmetrical. Meanwhile, in real life, he was limping around with a clubfoot, probably popping malaria fevers, and leaning on one of those 100 walking sticks buried with him. The contrast is, well, let's just say it's very on-brand for royalty. And then there's Inkhesenamun, Tut's half-sister, who became his wife. We touched on her earlier, but let's linger a little. She was one of Nefertiti's 6 daughters, and like Tut, she grew up in the strange, insular world of Akhenaten's religious revolution. Imagine being raised in a city where all the old gods were banned, where your parents were worshipping the sun disk, and then suddenly being dragged back into traditional Theban religion. It was whiplash, and she lived it. Her marriage to Tut was, of course, dynastic, a way to keep the bloodline pure, though by this point, pure basically meant structurally compromised. Their attempts to produce heirs failed, with 2 stillborn daughters buried alongside Tut in tiny coffins. And when Tut died, Enkhsenamon's options collapsed. Her desperate letter to the Hittite king is still one of the most extraordinary documents in history. For an Egyptian queen to write to a foreign enemy and say, "Please send me one of your sons, I'll marry him, and he'll be king of Egypt," that was shocking. It shows just how trapped she felt. She knew I wanted to marry her to legitimize his claim to the throne. And she wanted absolutely none of it. But her gamble failed. The Hittite prince never made it to Egypt. He was killed en route, probably assassinated. And sure enough, I married Enkhsenamon himself, took the throne, and she vanishes from the record. It's bleak. And it's also peak 18th dynasty drama. Now, let's drift gently toward the end of this family saga. After Tut, after I, came Horemheb. And Horemheb had one mission: clean up the mess. He restored Egypt's foreign power, reorganized the administration, and, most importantly, launched a campaign to erase the memory of his predecessors. Akhenaten, Nefertiti, Smenkhare, Tutankhamun, all of them were left off official king lists. Their monuments were defaced. Their names were scrubbed. It was historical cancel culture, ancient Egyptian style. Ironically, that attempt to erase Tut might have helped preserve his tomb. Without ongoing cults or memorials to keep attention on him, his burial site was forgotten, covered, and left alone until Howard Carter stumbled across it 3,000 years later. So here we are. Tutankhamun, the boy king, was less the shining star of Egyptian history and more a footnote in the great saga of the 18th dynasty. His reign was short, his health was poor, and his power was minimal. But his family? They were chaos personified. A father who alienated the nation. A stepmother who may or may not have ruled in disguise. A wife who begged for a foreign prince. Advisors who schemed their way to crowns. And a general who wiped them all from the record. It's messy, it's tragic, and it's exactly the kind of dynastic soap opera that makes history feel so much more human. Let's pause here. In the next stretch, we'll float forward to Tutankhamun's afterlife in popular culture. Because if his family erased him, the modern world more than made up for it. From the discovery mania of the 1920s, to Tut fever in the 1970s, to every child's first history lesson today, Tut became the unlikely poster boy of ancient Egypt. Across centuries, one haunting pattern repeats itself in royal dynasties: the shocking number of young heirs who never lived long enough to inherit the crown. Being born as the future king or queen should have meant power, wealth, and security, but in reality, it often meant the opposite. Many of these heirs were victims of disease, a cruel reminder that even palaces could not shield against medieval plagues, fevers, and infections. Childhood mortality was devastatingly high, and royal physicians, despite their best efforts, often had no remedies beyond bleeding, herbs, and prayers. But illness wasn't the only enemy. Political intrigue was just as deadly. A child heir represented both hope and danger: hope for loyalists who saw continuity, and danger for rivals who wanted the throne for themselves. Some heirs were quietly poisoned, smothered, or fell ill under suspicious circumstances, their deaths covered up as natural misfortunes. Even survival into teenage years didn't guarantee safety. Young princes were sent into battle to prove themselves, sometimes barely old enough to hold a sword, while princesses were married off as political pawns and died in childbirth before their crowns ever touched their heads. For example, Prince Arthur of England, Henry VIII's elder brother, was groomed to be king but died at just 15, leaving history to be rewritten in favor of Henry. In Russia, Tsarevich Alexei Romanov, the last heir of the Romanov dynasty, was cursed with hemophilia and constant threats to his fragile life, which ended brutally during the revolution. These lost heirs remind us that royal succession was never secure. A throne wasn't inherited by blood alone but won through survival in a world where even a prince's cradle was surrounded by shadows of disease, betrayal, and ambition. History is often told as a grand story of kings, battles, and empires, but the truth lies in the shadows, in the forgotten corners, in the lives of people who were never meant to be remembered. From female pirates who vanished into prisons, to children of fallen kings who carried the weight of their bloodline, to the strange diets, rituals, and daily struggles of people long gone, each hidden tale reminds us that the past is not just about rulers and wars, but about real humans with fears, hopes, and destinies cut short or reshaped by forces beyond their control. If these stories fascinated you, remember, history is not finished. Every archive, every old ruin, every dusty letter in a forgotten library still holds secrets waiting to be uncovered. And the more we dig into the past, the more we realize, the strangest stories were never fiction. They were lived.